Today's big show is on the Spanish-American War. The story of the Spanish-American War really begins with the Cuban Rebellion. Cuba was one of Spain's oldest and richest colonies, producing nearly one-third of the world's sugar. By the early 1890s, the United States and Cuba had become closely linked economically. Cuba exported most of its sugar to the United States. In 1894, the United States put a protective tariff on Cuban sugar, and that created a crisis in Cuba. So a tariff is a tax on imports, and the United States put that tax on Cuban imports of sugar, Cuban sugar, to protect sugar growers in the United States. By making Cuban sugar more expensive, manufacturers would be more likely to buy American-produced sugar. The problem is that created a huge economic problem in Cuba. With much of the Cuban population suffering from significant poverty, Cuban rebels launched a rebellion against Spain in 1895, caused by this economic crisis brought about in large part by the protective tariff that the United States put on Cuban sugar. But keep in mind, the workers were hurt, but so were the plantation owners, most of whom were Spanish. So the rebels declared independence in September of 1895. Spain retaliated by sending 200,000 troops to Cuba to put down the rebellion. Now, America almost immediately became and was sympathetic to the Cuban cause. Relating to, there was a lot of analogies drawn to the American colonies breaking away from Great Britain in 1776. Stories of Spanish atrocities in American newspapers swayed many Americans to support the rebels. There was all kinds of horror stories about what the Spanish were doing to the Cuban natives. And that brings us to this idea of yellow journalism, which is a type of sensational, biased, and often false reporting for the sake of attracting readers. Two major newspapers out of New York City both were trying to see who could outdo each other with sensational stories, some of which were not true. There was some American property being destroyed in Cuba, and some of it by the Cuban rebels. They actually felt like if they destroyed American property, then the Americans would get involved and help kick Spain out of Cuba. Spain offered Cuba autonomy, self-rule, but said they must remain in the Spanish Empire. And that's why in this slide the word autonomy is in quotes. Cuba, of course, refused. They wanted independence. President McKinley sent the USS Maine, a U.S. battleship, to Havana to protect American lives there. In the Havana harbor on February 15th, the USS Maine blows up, and it killed 266 Americans. On April 19, 1898, Congress proclaimed Cuba independent and demanded that Spain withdraw. 5 days later, on April 24th, Spain declares war on the United States. And that led to a war on two fronts, the Philippine Islands and in Cuba. The Philippine Islands, which is in the western Pacific, that was a colony of Spain, and Spain had much of its fleet, his naval fleet, in the Philippines. Commodore Dewey, commander of the American fleet in the Pacific, destroyed the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay. And while that's going on, 17,000 U.S. troops land in Cuba, and American warships also attacked the Spanish ships in and around Cuba. Pictured here is, in the middle of the picture standing, is Teddy Roosevelt, who would go on to become president in about 3 years from this photograph. He actually fought in the Spanish-American War. The war didn't last very long, and it didn't go very well for Spain. The Treaty of Paris was officially signed December 10, 1898, but the fighting was pretty much done by July of 1898. And in the Treaty of Paris, Cuba gained independence, U.S. acquired Puerto Rico and Guam from Spain, and the U.S. pays Spain $20 million for control of the Philippines. The Platt Amendment, passed by Congress, Cuba got its independence, but Cuba could not make a treaty with another country that might weaken its independence. Cuba had to allow the United States to buy or lease naval stations in Cuba. Cuba's debts to other countries had to be kept low. This was because the United States didn't want other countries to have a financial hold on Cuba. The United States had the right to intervene militarily to protect Cuban independence, and the United States got to decide when Cuban independence was threatened. Along with this, the Four-Acre Act was passed, which established a government for Puerto Rico. Puerto Ricans eventually became U.S. citizens, and they can elect their own government. However, Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory, not a state, so they don't have any of the rights that states have. It's a U.S. territory. The United States controls it. In the Philippines, after removing the Spanish from power, the U.S. fought the Filipino rebels. So the United States got rid of the Spanish, but then they wanted to control the Philippines, and the Filipinos, the natives, wanted no one to control them but themselves, and so they actually fought the Americans then, and that war would go on for quite a while. The U.S. would be successful and control the Philippines, and the Filipinos would not gain full independence until 1946, so about almost 50 years after the end of the Spanish-American War. And that is the end of your big show on the Spanish-American War, the time when the United States really became a world power with colonies.